So welcome everyone. My name is Kevin Madison and my pronouns are he, him, and I'm excited to be with you all tonight. I work as the Associate Director for Master's Programs with Dragonfly. I see lots of familiar faces and a few new ones and names. So if you want to, if you don't mind just turning on your cameras if you can, if you're in a place where you can for a brief moment, and then certainly once we get presenting, it's fine, whatever you need to do, if you need to turn off your camera, mute, all that stuff, but it's just nice to see everyone. So welcome to Katie, and thanks so much for joining and sharing your thoughts with us. Well, actually, before I introduce you officially, first off, thanks to Celeste Williams, who's going to help with monitoring the chat. So as folks might have any questions come to mind, feel free anytime is okay in the chat. And I think Carolyn Potter was going to introduce the Project Diversify group. So I'll hand it over to Caroline.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. Yes, so I'm a member of Project Diversify, and we're always looking for new members. We have a Google group, we have a Facebook group, and I'm going to read a statement just explaining about what our group is. Project Diversify is a cooperative of Project Dragonfly students, alumni, staff, and affiliates committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, both within the program itself and in the greater conservation, biology, and education fields. Project Diversify is dedicated to creating and fulfilling actionable steps towards a stronger, more diverse community at Miami University, and especially for students in Project Dragonfly, supporting the voices of BIPOC, LGBTQ+, and people living with disabilities within the field of conservation, and fostering networking between and among BIPOC, LGBTQ+, and people living with disabilities. So the way to join is to fill out our Google form. I'm going to drop the link in the chat for that. And you can also find us on Facebook, and I'll put the link in the chat for that. And my name is Caroline Cotter. I have a Miami email address. You can reach out to me, and also through the Google group, once you're joined up, you can reach out to all the people who are in the group. So it's a great way for networking, and we have various different subcommittees working on different areas of that work. So looking forward to seeing you all in that space. And Kevin, am I turning it back to you?
Yeah, thanks so much, Carolyn, for all that. And this group has been amazing, so definitely encourage folks to join. And welcome again to everyone. I know people are logging in at different times. So I'll just introduce Katie. Katie Dell works as an outdoor educator and teacher naturalist for Baltimore County Public Schools in Maryland. She has her Bachelor's of Science in Biology from Towson University and a Master of Arts in Biology from Miami University Global Field Program. She also leads field courses for the Vermilion Sea Institute in Baja, Mexico, and is the community outreach coordinator working there to help build capacity around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to make that international organization more welcoming to visitors, volunteers, and partners from all walks of life. So Katie, we're, like I said, honored to have you, and I will just turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks everybody for being here tonight. Let me start by just saying this has diversity, equity, and inclusion has 100% been a journey for me as a white person, and continues to be a journey. So I am by no means an expert. I am still learning each and every day. And I would definitely encourage, your questions, your thoughts, your feedback as we go through this evening as well. So don't be afraid to pop it in the chat, and we'll have plenty of opportunities to have some discussion in kind of what we're talking about, and also at the end, if you have questions or anything else you want to bring up. So, all right, let me try and share my screen again. Like, I hope Jill didn't jinx me saying that I was a pro at this now. How'd we do? Did we make it? All right, perfect. So tonight we're really going to be talking about equity and conservation. We typically in the past have really talked about these things kind of separately. So maybe in our professions, we're talking about equity, but tonight I really want to focus in on why this is such a must for conservation and how we as leaders in conservation organizations, whether we identify as white people or BIPOC people, we can really start to get moving in the right direction. Conservation is generally a pretty white space here in the United States. And so what can we do, no matter how we identify, to kind of keep that conversation moving forward? And I recognize that that is not easy. So we're going to do that in kind of 3 parts. The first part is going to be looking at CCAR Protocol. That stands for Courageous Conversations About Race. It was developed by Glenn Singleton, and it's just the language that I use. It's what I sort of used when I started doing equity work. So I'll introduce that to you or refamiliarize you with it just before we get started. Can you just give me like a 1 in the chat? Actually, let's do a 5 to a 1, like 5, like, yeah, I use this at my work or wherever all the time. 1, I've never heard of that protocol before, just so I can get kind of an idea. Okay, cool. Awesome. All right, so then we're going to talk about, so we're going to go from like a really personal level of like a protocol that can help you personally engage with this kind of equity work, especially discussions around things like race or other identities. Then we're going to talk about equity and conservation, and then we'll wrap up talking about this idea of knowing better and doing better, and sort of the journey that I went on through Project Dragonfly and the research that I did, and how that's changed even over the last 5 or 6 years, how I've come to different understandings of that through different avenues and different experiences and just new perspectives on the work that we're doing here. So let's start with that protocol. Well, before we do that, I'll let you read this quote. This is from one of my favorite books, The Sum of Us. I'll just give you like a minute to read through that. And if you could choose 1 or 2 words from that quote or an idea from the quote that jumps out to you, what would that be? I know earlier we had kind of a conversation about hope and how tough that can be in this work. And if you haven't had a chance to read this book, it's a really good just kind of culmination of racism in America and how racism has impacted communities for all of us. So sometimes we think that racism has maybe only impacted people of color, but in fact, it impacts everyone based on what we include or exclude in our communities and how we interact, especially in public spaces. Ooh, yeah, problem solving means change. And change is hard. It's not easy. Yeah, I do love, that's the part that sticks with me. The situation is not inevitable or immutable. We don't have to keep doing what we've always done, but it will take a critical mass of us to prevent that from happening. And to me, that's really what this work is about. How can we bring more people into this conversation so that we have enough people to say, hey, this really isn't working. And it's not just working, it's not just not working for a few people over here. It's not working for a lot of us. And it's important that we start making it work in a better way. Awesome. All right, so we are going to start with this idea of courageous conversations about race. And this is from the work of Glenn Singleton. He has a whole book about it. It's a pretty thick textbook style book, so I am not going to do it justice in the 2 slides that I'm giving it tonight. But the idea here is that as a country, so this is very USA specific, we are not good at talking about race. We've been conditioned to change the subject. We've been conditioned to whisper about it, but we have certainly not been conditioned to have a constructive conversation about race and how it impacts us or our communities. So if we can make space for that by using this protocol, we can start to have the conversation, we can engage in it, and we can start to deepen the conversation. We can start to ask questions, we can start to build empathy, we can start to understand each other. But in order to do that, we have to kind of hold each other accountable to this protocol. Because if we just try and have a conversation about race, as I'm sure probably all of you have experienced at one point or another, it doesn't always go well. So we're sort of constructing a space to say like, hey, we are going to talk about this. So there are kind of three parts to the protocol. And again, I am not doing this whole theory justice in a slide, but sort of the idea is that, first of all, there are 4 agreements. When we decide to have a courageous conversation, whether it's about race or whether it's about another identity, it could be a gender identity. It could even be a hard conversation just about, I know like even in my family, like money is sometimes hard to talk about. This protocol can actually help with any difficult topic, but it's specifically designed around the idea of race. So when we're starting a conversation, we're going to keep in mind 4 agreements. So we're going to stay engaged. We're going to stay focused on what we're doing. We're not going to let anything else creep into what we're doing. And we're also going to notice when we get disengaged. So if at any point tonight you find yourself checking your phone, checking your email, maybe you're a teacher and you have some grading to do, just give yourself a little self-check, like, when was it that I tuned out? What was being said? What was being experienced? And what does that kind of say about where I am right now? You're going to speak your truth. So keeping things from your perspective. So I can only speak as a white lesbian woman here in America. That's the perspective I have. I can't tell you about my roommate in college who was, a Pacific Islander. Like, I can't speak to their experience. If we experience something together, I can talk about that, but I want to keep it from my perspective, what I know to be true in an experience. The third part, and this is the hardest one for a lot of people, is that we're going to experience discomfort. As a white person, it feels uncomfortable to talk about race, not because we're bad people, but because society has conditioned us to not problem solve around this idea, right? And so it's going to be uncomfortable for me as a white person, and it's also likely going to be uncomfortable for people of color or marginalized communities to have to talk about these experiences. So we're recognizing that up front, that this is uncomfortable and that we're going to take a risk, and we are going to recognize that everyone is feeling uncomfortable in this moment. And then lastly, expecting and accepting non-closure. Like, we're not going to solve a problem. We're not going to walk away being like, yes, this feels really great. We definitely did the best thing, which some of us crave a lot. We're just here to build empathy and understanding. And sometimes that doesn't lead to agreement. It just leads to people sharing their experiences. And that's okay. We don't have to come up with a solution. We don't have to feel like we agree. So then the other part of this, as we share, is keeping it personal, local, and immediate. So again, sharing your stories. So this is where the sentence starter at the bottom comes in with these 2 conditions on isolating race or other identities. So you'll hear me frequently say, like, as a white lesbian woman, and then I'll continue with our next tool, which is the compass. So the compass is sort of the foundation of this protocol. And that's the idea that there are really 4 spaces we can be in as people. We can be in a moral place where we're focused on our beliefs, something that we believe in our core and our gut. It like makes us up and drives us forward. We can be in an emotional space. And I really think of this like, those feeling charts, if you're like an educator, where it's like happy, sad, angry, frustrated, that's our feeling space. If we can put one of those little emotions on it, then we're feeling, right? We can be in a thinking space. I find that as a white person, I get to spend a lot of time in my thinking space because lots of things aren't necessarily causing me harm. I might witness them, but I have the privilege of thinking about them, asking questions about them, wondering about them, rather than actually feeling them or having to hold a belief about them. And then lastly, we can be in an acting space where we're actively doing something. This, I think it's confusing. And we talked a little bit about this earlier when some of us were here. We typically think of acting as like a big coordinated effort, but acting can also be like reading a new book, following someone new on social media, expanding who's in our circle and what voices we're uplifting. It could be working on ourselves, taking some time to recognize our biases, having these conversations, right? Like what you're doing right now, even though it feels like we're only going to have a conversation, this was an action. You showed up tonight, and we're working on something in community. So the idea of the compass and kind of identifying where you are on the compass is that we can sort of decide if we can have a productive conversation. So if we enter into a conversation and I say, you know what, someone just did X, Y, or Z to me, and I'm really in my feelings, we might not have a productive conversation because feelings are hard to move on from. But what we can agree on is that if I want to move from my feelings kind of back to the center of the compass, then I need to do some thinking about my feelings. And when I think about my feelings, I can start to get centered. If I want to look at my actions, I also need to look at my beliefs because they're across from each other on the compass. So the other nice thing about the compass is that you can really kind of examine yourself by going all the way around. So if you find yourself having a thought, what is the emotion that goes with that thought? Where did that come from in terms of your beliefs? What kinds of actions might that thought lead to? And are they beneficial actions or are they harmful actions? So this is really just kind of giving you all 4 quadrants to think through, no matter how you identify, to just help you navigate yourself. We don't give ourselves a lot of time to navigate ourselves. And so this is a tool to really help us do that. So before I move on, does anyone have any questions about that? And again, not doing this justice, but I do think it's really helpful to have this language to start to understand ourselves. So I thought we would do a little example because I think as a teacher, I think examples sometimes speak a little bit easier to what we're trying to talk about than when I'm just like, this is a compass, here's what we do. So I'm going to give you an example, and this one is about bullying, just to kind of give us some leeway here to understand how the compass works. So we have, let's see, 2, 4, 6, I think there's 8 statements. And we're just going to have a quick little conversation about each statement and kind of decide where does this go on the compass. So we'll start at the top. When I see someone being bullied, I am not sure how I can help them. Where would you put that on the compass? Is that a belief? Is it a feeling? Is it a thought? Is it an action? And I can see the chat for what it's worth. Yeah, I would generally agree. That's a thought. I'm thinking about the situation. I haven't engaged with it emotionally. I don't necessarily see a belief revealed in that, other than maybe I do think that someone being bullied needs help, right? Like from that thought, I can see that that's something that this person believes, but it hasn't resulted in an action yet. Okay, so then for the second one, bullying happens. There's not a lot we can do about it. Yeah, for sure. This is a belief, right? And again, I'm coming at this from an education lens. And I can tell you there are teachers in a middle school who would say like, yeah, I don't know, they can figure it out, right? Like kids can figure out bullying. They'll be fine. And that's a belief. And if I can see that that's someone's belief, we can build some empathy, but we're probably not going to agree. Right? But I can start to see then how that belief has influenced that person's feelings about maybe the person who's being bullied. They maybe don't have as much empathy as I might have. I can see how it influences their thinking and their actions. I am not going to expect that adult to report a bullying behavior to a guidance counselor or something like that. So it just starts to give us more understanding of where we're coming from. And I can also start to dig in like, well, why do you believe that? You know, what experiences have you had that's the belief that you have? That's a really deep conversation that we can have that we could not have had before. We would have just ended up being like, no, we don't agree with each other. Right. How about the third one? Sometimes making fun of someone else makes me laugh. These are all like right from middle schoolers too, by the way. Yeah, I think this one kind of straddles two different categories, and that's okay. And we might not always realize that kind of how we respond is in two different categories. But yeah, I can actively laugh, right? And that's an action. Or I can say like, oh, well, I think bullying's funny. That would obviously make that a feeling. So it sort of depends on where we're coming from. And it's just more important that we see how it moves between the two quadrants than we put it specifically in one quadrant. So don't get caught up if you're like, I'm not really sure where this goes. That's okay. But that's sort of why we're practicing with this. So then the fourth one, I wonder what it would be like to be bullied. Ooh, I like seeing different people's responses.
Oh.
Yeah, I see this as more thinking, like that active wondering is a way of thinking and trying to connect. But I think you can also start to connect it to a feeling then. So this is how we move around the compass, right? Oh, I'm wondering what this is like. And that can move me into my feelings, but really only if I let it. I could just leave it as like, oh, I wonder what that feels like. Or I can say, let me look at the emotions. That might be some options for what this feels like. And then that moves me into a different quadrant. It is pretty empathetic. I would agree with that. I stand up to bullies by telling them to stop. Yeah, definitely acting, right? And if we walk through the other parts of the quadrants, we can be like, okay, so if this person is standing up to bullies, then they think that, maybe a person being bullied is a victim. They feel empathetic towards that person, or they feel angry about someone being bullied or something like that. And they believe that bullying is wrong. So we can start to walk through all of the other pieces and kind of make sure they align. Because sort of the worst thing that can happen, especially when we talk about equity work, is when I say, oh, I have this belief about whatever. And so I took this action. And then all of a sudden, maybe we realize those aren't really aligned with how we think and feel. And that's where harm gets caused. So if we can really walk around this compass and say like, okay, I believe this, I'm thinking about this, it makes me feel this way, and this is what I'm doing about it. If all those things are aligned, then it probably makes more sense. That's not to say we can't make a mistake when things aren't aligned, but it definitely gives us a more holistic view than when, like I know as a teacher, I'm like, I'm going to do a thing. If I don't take the time to walk through all those other pieces, I may end up doing something that's not the best thing. Bullying makes me sad and upset. Yeah, that one's pretty clear cut. Definitely a feeling. You see that like emotion chart in there, right? When I see or hear bullying, I tell a teacher or guidance counselor. Yep, definitely an action. And then bullying is wrong. It's something we need to work hard to stop. Yeah, and you can see kind of as you go through these and you get a little bit more practice, it starts to make more sense. Like, oh, this goes here, this goes here, this goes here. And again, this is really about being able to say, like, can we have a conversation with where we are on the compass right now? And can we build some understanding? Like, if we are all responding to the same kind of stimulus, and I'm in thinking, but you're in feeling, like, let's have a conversation about why, because that's really going to show us our different world experiences. All right, and this one just kind of has them separated out because I didn't want to have to move them on screen because that would be a whole other thing I had to figure out. And again, it's not as important that you like are great at sorting these sentences. That's not what it's about. It's that you can kind of walk yourself through the 4 different pieces. All right, so then the second part of this, and actually, let's try this, I think. So, because I want to get some people involved here. I don't really like to talk to myself. So let's say this sentence is kind of rings really true to me. I think equity is really important, especially for conservation organizations that are led by white people or engage predominantly white populations. So what I want you to do is kind of, when I say that sentence, and I'll say it again, where does that put you on the compass? So you're going to use that sentence starter down at the bottom. and draw out at least one of your identities. It can be your racial identity. You can add in other identities if you want. And then where does that put you? Are you in your feeling, your believing, your thinking, or your acting? And actually, I'll put this sentence in the chat just so we can be a little more equitable. So the idea was, I think equity is particularly important for conservation organizations led by white people or serving predominantly white populations. Awesome. Thank you for your responses. And this is not to say that I don't think equity is important for organizations that don't fit those criteria. But I think we're finding ourselves in a situation where it's so crucial that white people and white conservation organizations really step up and embrace this idea and start working with it, so that we can have safe spaces for everyone and their humanity, and so that we can really do conservation justice on a social level. And we're going to talk more about that in just a second. Yeah, and the one thing that I know feels hard with this initially, and again, this is something that I learned, so I remember this feeling hard for me as a white person, was this idea of kind of putting all my identities out there. We're sort of been conditioned not to do that. Like, oh, if you can get by with not saying a whole lot about yourself, like great. But what that does is it gives us a lens. It gives other people the lenses through which we're seeing the world. And that's really important to build that empathy and have that conversation, because my lens is not the same as your lens. And when I recognize that, I go like, oh yeah, okay, right. This is why we have different experiences. And that's really important. It's also really important because for years, we've said things like, oh, you know, that group of people is Black or is mixed race or is Jewish. But never in my childhood growing up here in Maryland can I think of a time where anyone said, oh, that group of people is white. So we're sort of leveling the playing field in terms of our identities. That white is an identity, it is an experience, and it has some things that go with it, just like being Black or being Asian or being Jewish. It's not the norm. It's not, it doesn't have to be the dominant culture. And so it just kind of gives power to all the different identities by saying what we are. Awesome. Thank you for sharing and practicing that protocol. I know it's a lot to digest. Like, let me tell you what, this is normally like a 3-hour thing when I do it. So we're not gonna dwell on that. Ooh, good question. So I see Sharon's question in the chat. How do we stop the continuum of identities? Doesn't the norm also matter to the context? Yeah, it does. It totally does. And so part of this is also recognizing what the quote unquote norm or the dominant culture is. And a lot of times when we're talking about the United States, the culture, even if it's not like I'm living right outside of Baltimore. So even though I'm in a predominantly Black area, the dominant culture is still white, because we're operating in government systems and school systems and church systems that were all built on pretty white principles. So yeah, you're totally right. It does matter what the norm is. And we could go to other countries and this wouldn't apply. And something that we kind of continually work on with Vermilion Sea Institute is like, okay, we're white people now in a different country in Mexico, where whiteness means something totally different than it means in America. And what does that mean for our equity work? And how does that relate to us as conservationists and the work that we're doing? Yeah, I think that's a great way to describe it. And I think, in terms of the continuum of identities, one of the reasons I think that it's nice for people to kind of put out their identity is because you start to see also what's important to them. If I just say to you, I'm a white person, and I don't bring my queer experience or my lesbian experience to the table, you're not really seeing my whole lens. And so when we ask people to put in whatever identities they feel like are important to that situation, it might change. You might feel like where you're living, like I saw somebody throw in the word rural, is important in one context, but not another. And that's okay, because you're recognizing what lenses you're looking through, just like glasses. Ooh. Okay, so why equity? And I kind of alluded to these two things already. And again, we're going in like really broad strokes here. I could talk about this for many, many, many more hours, but I'm going to keep things pretty broad tonight. And if you have other questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm also going to give you my contact information at the end. The first reason is people, right? Like this is about people's humanity and having safe spaces to be a part of. And when we think about a lot of our conservation spaces like parks, they weren't made to be inclusive spaces. If you like read up on the history of parks, they really started with European nobility, and they were not for the common people. If you think about the gardens in France and England, that was sort of the very first idea of a park, and it was not for everyone. And then if you kind of go forward in history and you look at the United States, parks, just like water fountains and libraries and movie theaters, are one of the many things that get segregated during that segregation period. And again, we're talking like separate, but definitely not equal, right? Like you've got the white park down the street that's really nice and has all of these amenities. And then you have a black park that's super tiny and not well kept and isn't getting the resources that the white park is. So there's this really big historical context about why parks and public spaces can be challenging for marginalized and oppressed people, or traditionally marginalized and oppressed people. And then you also have this idea of public spaces being policed spaces. And this came up with that Central Park birding incident, right? In that like, oh, we're in this public space, certain behaviors are expected. If you aren't conforming to those certain behaviors, that gives me a right as the dominant culture, the dominant person, to kind of impose my will on you or impose policing on you and your body and your values and what you're doing. And so like that becomes another issue. And if we look at, just policing in general, the idea that like I, as a white woman, can go birding with my hoodie up at 5 o'clock in the morning to record bird strike data, but my Black colleague maybe doesn't feel comfortable joining me because it's maybe not as safe for that person to be out with their hood up in the morning as we look for bird strike data. And so like, do we understand that? Are we aware of those things? And can we start to work to kind of chip away at dismantling some of those problems? And then the third piece of this is about humanity as well, is this idea of pay. And we talked a little bit about this earlier. Conservation tends to be, and I think it was with Jill's words, like a passion, right? And we don't pay people for their passions. We go like, oh, that's so nice of you that you really want to do this, and I'm not going to pay you very much for it. And so we run into a lot in conservation where we're like, oh, we would really love to hire some more diverse people, and we're going to pay them $15 an hour. It's like, well, okay, that maybe doesn't match up to the level of education that person has, worked through a lot of, oppression to get through, not even someone who worked through oppression, but anyone, the level of education that they have to do this job is not matching what you're paying them. And then in terms of opportunity, and I see this a lot here in Baltimore, because I'm close to DC, right? So we have conservation organizations that are like almost totally white women being paid maybe like $30,000 a year. And they have that opportunity because in some level, and this is very general, so please keep that in mind. I'm making a very general statement here. That opportunity exists because maybe that white woman is married to a white man who is making $70,000 to $150,000 in his job. And so she can take a job for $30,000 a year, when that might not be an opportunity for a different family organization or family structure, or even just a different opportunity for someone who hasn't had that white privilege and generational wealth across the years, right? And so that is a huge problem in terms of thinking about people and safe spaces and humanity. Like, we have to pay for the hard work that's going into this. I'm just checking the chat real fast. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Caroline. It is a huge problem across the nonprofit sector. It goes into education too. And this is, again, one of those instances where racism intersects, especially with gender. And we end up not paying women their fair share either, because, somewhere along the line, those two things got kind of intersected. They're like those passion projects. Oh, well, women are nurturing. They're going to do it anyway. It's their calling. We don't have to pay them as much because they're just going to make sure that the kids get taken care of. And so that gets really, really tough. Yes. The need for unpaid experience to get jobs. That's so true, especially in conservation with field work and everything that sometimes goes into it. Yeah, you have to be in a certain amount of privilege, whatever that privilege might be, right? To be able to take that unpaid time to get that experience for different jobs, for sure. All right, and so then the second part, this is something I really started focusing on in some of my studies with Dragonfly. Yeah, big thumbs down. Hi, Courtney Baxter. So the other part of this is this idea that we still remain, especially in the United States, quote unquote, self-segregated. Now, when we say self-segregated, that's not to say that communities decided to be segregated for whatever reason, socioeconomically, politically, for many, many, many reasons that are mostly on purpose. Our counties, our cities, our states, and even you can see in that census map, huge parts of the United States remain really segregated. And then if we as scientists, we know we're really going to rely on citizen science data moving forward, especially when we talk about things like climate change. If we are mostly engaging white, middle class, non-Hispanic people in our conservation and in our data sets, we are missing huge swaths of the country or huge parts of our counties. Yeah, Anna, that's a really great question. It actually comes right off the Census Bureau website. So the census does this, and it's like, it tells you right there which races have a population greater than the national average. That's the color it shows up. So what this translates into is like a huge impact on social justice, right? Because if we have, let's say we have folks in Cape Cod, the way we've currently framed conservation, which is more of a like, oh, we have extra time and resources, we'll do conservation. They might be taking data, mostly white community in the Northeast. They might have the time to go out and take their citizen science data. We look at somewhere like maybe Louisiana, where, just hit and pummeled by multiple natural disasters for a multitude of reasons, doesn't have the time or resources to gather the data. Then all of a sudden we get to these government grants that want proposals that need this conservation data, and one community has it because they had time and resources, and one community doesn't. And now we've found ourselves in this social justice issue around conservation. And that just sort of gives us that negative feedback loop of like, oh, conservation doesn't include me, right? It's not a space for me. It didn't help me. People aren't helping me or my community. And it just creates one more barrier to people participating. And that's sort of the spiral we continue to find ourselves in. Did anybody have any questions about that? This is like some heavy stuff, and we're just sort of painting in broad strokes. All right, so then this part is the part that involves all of us in this conversation, right? And that's this idea that when we know better, we can do better. But sometimes it's hard to want to know better, especially when we're in organizations and we already feel like we're not serving the people around us. It's hard to really dig in and have that difficult conversation. Yes, and I will definitely, I'll get that to you for sure. So I've sort of been following these 3 steps, and this was sort of what my last action project was on. And to be honest with you, the steps have changed a little bit as I've kind of grown in my own understanding of what this work looks like. But the first step is really to survey, right? And that looks like asking ourselves, okay, who lives near, in, around the space where we want to be engaging people? And then who are we actually engaging? Now, we all have like a general idea of who's coming, who's showing up, who's engaged in our programs, but sometimes that idea is really different than when we run the numbers. So I'll give you the example that I kind of started with. So this is for Lights Out DC, which is a bird strike program. And basically they were like, oh, we want to know how our population of volunteers compares to the population of Washington, DC. So they were operating kind of right in the heart of DC. They were having trouble getting volunteers. They knew their representation was skewed, but they didn't have anyone to put a number on that. And I should also say they were terrified to put these charts and numbers out into the world, because it can be scary, right? To admit like, hey, we're not serving everyone we want to be serving. We're not doing what we think is a good job in terms of equity. But it's also the first step. If we don't know who we are engaging and we don't know who's part of our community, we can't set the goals to move forward. So when we did this study, we found that there were really 2 places that they were over and underrepresented. And one was educational attainment, which was really predictable, right? Like I could have asked them on day 1, how are your volunteers different from the general population of DC? And they could have been like, well, most of them have master's degrees. And I don't think most of the general public in DC does. But it was important to put a number on this. We could see like, okay, yeah, 60%, that's a huge amount. You know, what are you requiring of your volunteers that it really feels like they need to have this advanced amount of knowledge? You know, where are you getting people from? Are you going to graduate schools and getting volunteers? Or are you going to high school STEM fairs and trying to engage students there? Because they could be part of this conversation too. And then of course, the other piece of this was really looking at race. So on the left, you have the race of Washington, DC. And I should also say that this was a fairly small sample size. So comparing their volunteers to like an entire population is not the most valid thing ever, but it certainly gave us a really good idea of who we were and were not engaging. So you can see in DC, it's about 50% African-American or Black, but then in Lights Out, it was 93% white. And I think they had 1 volunteer that reported as being Hispanic or Latino. So like there was work to do, right? And again, this was not a surprise. No one was surprised by this, but by putting a number on it and seeing the numbers, we could start to develop goals. Like, okay, this year, we were 93% white, 0% Black. Next year, let's try and get to here. You know, and developing the goal is not enough. And just to give you an idea, if you're like a total chi-squared nerd, here's sort of everything we looked at. So one thing that also came up was that they really thought that women were going to be overrepresented in their volunteers. But when we compared their volunteer data to the general population, they were actually not. So they thought that that was going to be a significant difference, and it wasn't. So they they were really playing this up like, oh yeah, we're going to engage more men. And it turned out that that wasn't really the biggest place that they needed to focus. So this is also important to just really solidify the idea of who needs to be engaged. And that's not to say that like, oh, there's just men, and then there's just people of color, and then there's just educational attainment. A lot of these things overlap and intersect. So also kind of thinking about, okay, well, what does this look like in my area? What are some of those intersectionalities, and how does that play out? So then the questioning part, and again, this time, this is the thing that sometimes I think we get wrong, right? Because sometimes it is easier to say something as a conservation organization and a conservation leader, say something like, well, why aren't they coming to my thing? And that's totally the wrong way to look at it. And that's not something that I would have realized maybe 10, even 12 years ago. The question is, what am I doing? What are we doing? What are we perpetuating that is preventing X, Y, or Z population from wanting to be a part of us? Because there are a lot of things, and some of them are historical, like we already talked about, and some of them are actively happening right now. I think about when I hire teachers, I go on their social media, I look at what they follow, I make some judgments about them, right? Like that's part of my hiring practice as the head of a department. And so to think that volunteers coming to an organization aren't doing the same thing is crazy. And if I'm only following certain people and I'm putting out certain things on Facebook or I'm endorsing certain things on social media, that volunteer gets to make a decision like, nah, there are better organizations, right? And so this really becomes a little bit about what we're doing, either as an individual or an organization or historical patterns that we can start to try and disrupt. So then the last thing is that we need to change. And I'll put out there that my original word was collaborate and kind of like reach out to different communities and ask them for feedback. And I don't really think that's fair anymore. I think the change has to happen before we can do that. So as a white person, as a white conservation organization, or even someone working in a predominantly white organization, we have to change before we can collaborate. We have to really look at what we're doing. If we keep doing what we've always done, we're going to keep getting what we've always got. And so we really need to look at that. And now it sounds like a tall order, right? It sounds like, oh, it's just such a short word. But I think there's a couple ways we can break this down. Like, how can we really start to change as an organization or as an individual? And I think the first part is to work on yourself. So if you are in any capacity a leader of a conservation organization, it definitely starts with you. And a lot of times we want to go to these big showy actions, but the best action we can take is educating ourselves and finding other ways to educate ourselves. Like I tell teachers all the time, you came to this workshop, you want a unit plan, you want to write a new lesson plan, you want a new behavior plan. Well, first we're going to work on you. Like you're going to be the product of this workshop. And then you can go make those other products. But first the product has to be you. And then the second part, and this one's really tough, is to examine your data. So not the data you just collected about your organization, but the data that you keep with you, the stories you tell yourself. Who do you follow on social media? Who do you look up to? What kind of language do you use? And then what does that say about you? Not to you, but to the people around you. When I think about this, I think about my students. Like, okay, if you ask me about my class, who do I think are the top 3 students? Who are the bottom 3 students? And is that reality? Because if I can't do that correctly, then we're going into number 3 and we're looking at my biases, right? My data is going to show me where I'm biased. And I think that kind of popped up in the chat here. How do you prevent the lenses from becoming a biased as opposed to growing diversity? It's hard. It's really hard work. And part of it is having a community like this to check those blind spots and say, hey, I'm not sure you considered this. Or when you said this, it made me feel X, Y, or Z. And so maybe you want to consider using this language moving forward. It really you have to have this like accountability culture, and you have to be able to have these conversations to be able to grow without just being like, this is the right way to do it. Now we're going to do this. And you make the same mistake that you were making before. So yeah, that's a really great question. And then I think the last part is just trying to expand your worldview, right? Read more books, listen to more podcasts, follow different people on social media, find different voices in the community. And it's not to say that you want to put on them solving your problems, but that you want to listen. Tell me about this. I heard you had a bad experience when X, Y, or Z happened. And I just want to listen to what that was like, if you're willing to share, right? And so much of this is built on relationship. And so much of it is built on how we communicate with one another and building trust with one another. Sometimes that's the only way we get permission to be able to expand our worldview. And that takes a lot of work. You can't just walk in and expect somebody to open up to you. And that's okay. It's hard work. So I think we have a little bit of time left. And I just wanted to do another quick check-in now that we've gone kind of all the way through this. Could you kind of check in again on the compass for me? And then we'll make some space for more questions, comments, whatever's coming up for you. And I feel kind of, I feel like I need to state, like, I had a lot of people of color help me on this journey to like understand equity and grow as a person and kind of try and do better. And I realized that they carried a really heavy burden. So I am also kind of actively, as a white person, trying to educate other people so that it's not always the burden of my colleagues of color, especially in education setting, right? And so when we have this knowledge, being able to step in and kind of take on some of those equity responsibilities, I also think is really important. Oh yeah, I love that idea. Knowledge creates responsibility. And I like to see people kind of moving around the compass. I know there was a lot of information. Sorry, I was like, well, how can I get it all in there? And one other thing I'll say is, like, our intention can be really good. No matter how we identify, we can have the best of intentions, but what matters at the end of the day is our impact. And the impact might not always be what we want it to be. And so having these tools to kind of help ourselves reflect and grow is so important in owning that impact and moving forward. I think that's all I got. So my contact information is up there. I gave you the shortest and easiest email address to reach me at. Ooh, great question, Kirsten. I really love, there are quite a few groups of Black birders that I follow on social media. They started Black Birding Week a couple years ago. And they've been awesome. There's also a lot of Black divers that I follow and marine biologists that I think have really, I was gonna say Courtney Baxter has good suggestions for you that are great. And then I think really reading books has been incredibly helpful to me. Stand from the Beginning is really interesting in providing the historical context to a lot of how things are in our country and just understanding that. There surprisingly aren't a lot of books on the parks and kind of the influence that race has historically had on parks, but there are a lot of papers that were actually written in the 90s and I think buried pretty deep because they were kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. I would have to look those up, but those are really good. Oh yeah, Green Voices of Color on Twitter. There's also one of my friends from here locally in Maryland. I'm trying to get her name correct. She's actually working on a new version of the Green Book. So she's a conservationist and an educator, and she is actually working on a new digital version of the Green Book across different states for conservation organizations and hotels and things like that, not just for people of color, but also for LGBTQ folks as well. Yes, Becoming was a great book. And I think it depends on where you are, right? Like most of my students are not white and they keep me real honest all the time. So that automatically expands my worldview, right? And so it kind of depends where you are and just being aware of how far you might have to push to have that worldview expanded, I think is also kind of a good gauge. Yes, thank you. I was like, I think it's Parker McMullen Bushman. Yes, that's exactly who it is. Thank you.
Oh, Katie, do you see the question with Julianne Turner?
Ooh, yeah, I see it now. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, Julianne. You know, sometimes we're going to make mistakes. And I think the best thing we can do is before, as a white person, right? Because again, I'm talking mostly as a white person here. The best thing I can do before I talk is really listen, if that's an opportunity that's afforded to me. And I think the other idea is really like, we have to understand each other and our motivations before we can start working together. So especially like when we talk about our work with Vermilion Sea Institute, we're recognizing that there's two really distinct cultures coming together. There's white American culture, and then there is a Mexican culture that is heavily influenced by colonization. And so how does that show up for each of us? You know, what do we see when we see each other? Like, what are some of the biases that come with that on both sides? And how can we kind of build that trust to move forward? Because it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes we come in and we're like, this is what we're doing. There's a good story I remember when I was in undergrad about like some scientists who were studying some like tiny little lizard near some cow and sheep herders. And they were like, look, we'll give you a TV if you stop bringing your cows here. And like, that was real, like a TV. They didn't have electricity. Like, you know, so what was valuable to the scientists who came in and were trying to do conservation was not valuable to the community. And so I think really kind of just comparing our values and understanding them and building that empathy is the first place to start. And realizing that they're different. And that's okay. Yeah, humble enough to ask honest questions from like a real curiosity. I heard someone say earlier in our group, it's a lot like inquiry, right? Sort of the best thing I can do is stay curious and look for answers that I know I don't have, right? Like in inquiry, we're accepting that we don't have the answer, but we're going to do some uncovering to try and find it. And it's the same kind of process with equity work. We don't have the answer. I can't decide what's best for a community, but I can definitely do some uncovering to see where we can work together.
Katie, thank you so much. And maybe we can
Thank you.
see if folks, if you can stop sharing, and then
I can.
we'll give you the traditional Dragonfly Cafe round of applause and thank you for everything.
Oh, thank you.
I think seeing that chat light up the first one of those early questions was just so emotional and amazing. So also thank you to all the participants. Celeste, we got all the questions in the chat, I think, right?
I think so.
Yes, now Katie has been on top of the chat, which has been awesome.
I got a lot of screens going.
And we'll be having another Dragonfly Cafe in about a month. So we'll send out information about that as we get it all set. Yeah, thank you so much again. And I see people putting that in the chat. I know we're about at the end of our time and people have things going on tonight. But yeah, does anyone else have anything, final words or anything else? Can you sign off?
I don't have any final words, but I wanted to do a big thanks, Katie. And also at some point, when there's time, I might talk more about your conversations down in Baja with that community, because that's a community which, you know, has a very unique history and a long history, yeah. And it's amazing to see what's unfolded there intergenerationally on both sides, actually on, you know, from, and it's, I just think there's so much to learn about, you know, how those dialogues evolved and changed over time, and what they're like now, and I haven't been back for a long time, and I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about that. So
Yeah, definitely.
great, and thank you for this great talk.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, good night, everyone, and thanks again, and have a lovely evening.